Hey, Technostads! Backup is actually a really cool subject, and I'm excited about getting into this video. However, I can tell you the times that I've had to use backup, usually it's not a good scenario, and there's quite a bit of stress it revolves around it. That is that when I have to do a backup, it's usually because there's an incident that requires me to use the backup, and I'm really questioning, is my backup good? Do I got the right type of backup? And there's some worry involved in it. But making sure that you have this all nailed down ahead of time can relieve some of the stress when it comes to having to use a backup. So in this video, let's go over some details around backup. In this video, we have quite a few things that we're going to cover. However, some of these things are going to just be more brief mentions that we're not going to get real in depth into. So we're going to get into just a brief mention about what is backup. We'll get into some considerations of backup. We'll talk about what to backup. We'll get into the media that you can use for backup, talk about media rotation and what that looks like. We'll talk about storage location, encryption, snapshots, restore types, recovery, media inventory. We'll talk about testing, retention period, archiving, and disposal. Quite simply, backup is just a copy of something, and we want a copy, a point-in-time copy of something to make sure if our systems go down, we can restore. We're going to be covering several different aspects to backup. And for each one of those aspects, there are several considerations that come into play as we make decisions. There's a lot of decisions that happen when it comes to backup, a lot of planning, a lot of ways that we could go about doing this. So let's talk about some of those considerations. First of all, we may decide differently depending on if it's recreatable data or not. That is, databases a lot of times house the data that we are collecting from our customers, from our users, things like what they're buying and how they're buying it and information like that, that it would be pretty devastating to lose that information altogether. We couldn't recreate it. Once that information is gone, we can't really reassemble that. Versus the servers that it's running on, we may be able to reestablish those, especially if we're a DevOps shop, we may be able to just spin up new servers and not really have an issue. And that is a form of system recovery, is we wouldn't necessarily have to have a backup to restore from if we have a full DevOps shop. And then we have the how critical these systems are and the data is. And we may want to back things up more often or less often, depending on what the criticality of those systems and data are. Then we have a cost perspective. The more frequent we do something, the more resilient we have something, the higher cost it's going to be. There's going to be a cost to that. There's also the recovery point objective and recovery time objective. How far back do we want to go, and how far, as far as how much data are we willing to lose, and how long is our recovery time. So that's the recovery point objective and recovery time objective. Then we have the disruption that it causes our users and the loss of reputation that may cause. So we want to have that as part of a consideration. When we're doing things like backup, there are times that it takes to actually do the backup. There's copy times, there's the time to manage larger files. So that goes into also determining how we're going to manage our backup. There's a level of security on how we're going to manage our backup and the sensitivity of that. And then also, how dynamic is that information that we're backing up? Is it changing a lot or is it changing very little? We may want to, if it's changing very little, we may want to not have to back it up very often. But if it's changing a lot, we may want to do it more often. So what type of things would we back up? Well, we may back up a database. More than likely, we probably want to back up a database. The files and folders, if it's non-recreatable data, things that we can't just recreate, then we probably most definitely want to do that. A lot of times we do want to back up the servers. If we want a quick recovery time, if backing up the servers allows us to just do a restore and we're back up and running. And that has saved me many times. We may choose to do configurations, like if we have some sort of application, we may want to back up the configuration settings of that application, or a system state, which is like the configurations of a machine. We can back up just that system state rather than the whole server, and that saves us on backup time there. Or maybe it's some sort of directory information like Active Directory. And this is actually, a lot of these are interrelated here, but the directory information, a lot of times it's on some sort of database on the back end. You can think of it as what level you want to back up. Do we want to back it up on the machine level? Do we want to do it on the disk level? Do we want to do it on the volume level, the folder level, or the file level? I mean, file level is great from a speed perspective. We can constantly back up those files and not have any issues. But if we need to restore large amounts of data, then that becomes more difficult if we're doing it a single file at a time. And so that's where we might want to do a volume level. Or if there's some critical services, then maybe we'll want to do it on machine level and back up that. Same thing with the database. We could back up a whole database, or we could be backing up specific tables on that database, or there are transactions that happen, or the records that are being entered in, and so we could just back up the transaction logs. When you're considering what level you want to back up at, whether I want to do it at a machine level, a volume level, or a file level, there's a lot of considerations here. All of these are probably applicable in some way or another, but one really stands out to me is the cost. It costs a lot more to do a machine level because there's a lot more data involved versus a file. Although storage is relatively cheap, but if I'm paying for the bandwidth to ship it off-site, then that might be a problem. It also might be a problem with copy times. Media is the objects that we are actually going to store this on. So it could be in the cloud, it could be removable media, it could be tape, it could be disk. We could actually print it out, and that's a form of backup. It's actually a pretty good form of backup, except for it wastes a lot of paper, therefore playing into our cost with this once again. There's also, I might have concerns around security up in the cloud. So that could be a concern versus if I actually had it in possession. The tape here is not necessarily known as being a great storage mechanism for data. That sometimes tapes can be corrupt. So I might be a little leery about that from a criticality standpoint. Some of your media is going to require some rotation involved. An example of that is tape. So if we have on-site backup onto our media set here, this is set 1, and then I'm going to keep a couple sets off-site. And then what I would do, I actually did this, I had a safe at home and I kept the media in the safe, which I wouldn't do again, by the way. But in this case right here, what I would do is I'd bring set 2 in, I'd swap it out for set 1 and bring the set 1 home. So we always had an off-site copy of the data. Storage location is important as well. If we store it on site, that's great because it's really accessible and we can grab the data and restore it right away. So it really makes our recovery time objective very short. However, the problem with that is if the fire happens at this and we lose that data, that's problematic. So we may want something that's off-site, or maybe we have both an on-site copy to get good RTO time, but an off-site to create some location redundancy here. We may want to consider encryption as well. In fact, and most of what I would say is that you almost always want encryption involved. No matter where you're locating your data at, you most likely want to put encryption on it. There is something called snapshots, and the concept of snapshots is all the same, although implementation of snapshots really widely vary. And so I'm going to go over just a common way that these snapshots are created and what they look like. So let's take a look at that. So we have a document right here. And if I were to take a snapshot of that document, that would solidify this document and it would not be changed at all. It would create another file, and then I would record all the changes that happen on this document actually get recorded on this separate file. and that's a snapshot. And I could actually take a snapshot of this then. And if I were to take a snapshot of this, then it would create yet another file and record the information of all the changes on that file. And then when I'm accessing this file, what it's just doing is it's taking all of these files and putting them together, and that's what I see. So it doesn't, from a user perspective, doesn't seem like it changes at all. But one thing to note about this is that this can be a form of backup in some systems. You have some storage systems that actually use snapshots, and it's not a problem to keep those long-term and stuff. And then VMware uses snapshots, but if you have snapshots on your machine for any length of time, it causes performance issues because it's got to read from so many documents to recreate that machine operational state. So snapshots, once again, it's implemented differently out there, but they're all kind of the same concept where it freezes the original and then starts a delta. We call this a delta, the changes. It creates the changes in separate files, just like this. One thing to note is if I ever delete a snapshot, what would happen is it would then make the changes, merge them into this document right here, and then do away with all these extra data right here. Or I could delete this snapshot, it would merge the changes into here, and then do away with all of the extra there, and now you just are back to one document. That was how to use snapshots as backup, but let's talk about using snapshots for backup. And the reason why I say this is because there are problems sometimes if this document is being edited and I try to create a backup of that file. It's changing. It's in the process of being changed. And so that's problematic if I'm trying to grab a backup of that and it's changing at the same time, then that's going to mess up the backup copy. So one thing that can happen with some systems is it will create a snapshot. It will solidify this original copy. You'll be making changes. Once again, it's not perceptive from the user that's using this, but you'll be making changes on this change document. Then I can grab this as a copy, or the system, the backup system is grabbing a copy of this. And then once it's done, it deletes that snapshot and remerges these changes back into this document. There are times when a user comes to me and says, can you restore this document? And there's a few different options on how I can restore this document. Number one, I could just restore it and it overwrites the original document. They no longer have access to that original document. The backup now becomes the original, becomes the main document. Or sometimes I can just restore right in the same folder, side by side, then they have access to now the new document. It's named a little differently. Maybe it has the copy attached to the end of it, something like that. So it differentiates the two, but it's just in the same folder. And then I could actually put it in an alternate path. Maybe I'm even restoring a whole folder and I can just restore it to another location and say, now you can access it, but you can access it through here. And this is pretty important too, to notify the user on how you're restoring that, because are they going to end up editing two different documents, or do they need to just have access to one document? It could be confusing if there's multiple options here. So making sure you're clear with the end user on how you're restoring it. One thing that will happen is when you're restoring things, you may want to do a media inventory at the beginning of it. This was really common with tapes because you didn't necessarily know what was on the tape, so you put the tape back into the unit and do a media inventory of that unit to get an index or a record of what's actually on that media, so you can pick and choose what you want restored. One thing you'll want to do is do backup testing to make sure that you have all of the information that you need for a restore. An example of this is, let's say you have an application up in the cloud and you don't do testing on it, and now it comes time to actually use that backup, but you go to restore that data and you'll find you're missing components. Or maybe you'll find that your tape is getting old and so now the data is becoming corrupt and it's no longer a good copy. So you want to make sure that you're testing your backups. Retention period is how long we want to keep something. So if we do a backup, we are going to do a backup here, and how long are we going to keep it? Are we going to keep it an hour? Are we going to keep it a day? Are we going to keep it a week, a month, a year? So how long is that data going to be useful? And so we need to weigh that out and determine what our retention period is going to be and stick with that. Now, as that data gets older, there may be a determination at some point in time, there might be a chance that we want to use that data again, but probably not. But if we do, it's going to be super valuable. And that's where archiving comes into play, is we may sometimes choose to archive data. Having old data sit on things like our database server is just going to slow the performance down. It's going to cause issues. There's some security concerns with that. So let's offload it to an archive. And the archive is going to sit in a secure location. It's going to be cheaper media because we don't care as much about it. And then just in case maybe we go back to that archive and do a restore of it, but probably not. Probably don't need it, which is why it's sitting in archive. We also have to think about disposal of all of this. So there are times when a customer doesn't want this to have their records anymore, that we have to rip that information out of our databases. Well, don't forget that you have a copy on backup. And so we need to dispose of that as well. And we also have one in archive. So it's one of the reasons why data becomes a liability, because if this customer is expecting their data to be gone and wiped from your system, but we have it in backup and archive form and something gets stolen out of that and we have to go back and notify that customer, that could be problematic. So there really is a lot of considerations when we're looking at backup and decisions that we have to make all along the way. What is going to be best for you? And it really depends on your scenario. So we talked about what is backup. We talked about some of those considerations that you would have and what to back up, the media rotation, storage location, encryption, snapshots, restoring the restore type or how you're going to recover from that. We talked about media inventory and how that can categorize your backup so that way you can go back and access it. We talked about testing, retention period. We talked about archiving the data, and we finished off talking about disposing the information.